Hey, welcome to my video on Atlantis and Telepylos. So, this is a video that will discuss. I will just talk. No, I'm not going to discuss it. I'm going to be talking it because I have nobody here to speak with. So, just me, myself, and I, and you. But you're not going to be talking to me. Unfortunately, I don't have the comments set up for this live feed, so I'm just going to be speaking. A little rant, not a rant, I guess, more of a discussion on what Atlantis is in popular media, our conceptions of Atlantis, where it is, the theories around it, and I'm going to basically hint at where it is, but not directly reveal it yet. Perhaps, where do we start? Let's start with Plato. Obviously, the story of Atlantis begins with him and the dialogues, specifically the Critias, which, more than the Timaeus, describes much of what points to the actual Atlantis in its description, more than its government and a few other things. It's the Critias that explicitly describes Atlantis. So, how do I put this? It's a strange tale that we get the Critias from Plato, and how it's described through Plato, how he gets the story himself. Now, you could take the assumption that the tale he tells is how actually the knowledge came to him, as in Solon was the one who originally got the information and passed it along to his countrymen, and passed it on to Critias. That's how it's portrayed through Plato. But much like writers in our modern time, they don't really put themselves in the main character. So to say that Solon was the main source of the information is kind of a mistake, a mistaken assumption, because that's not really where the information comes. You wouldn't think that a Tom Clancy novel, the information comes from the characters. It comes from Tom Clancy and his information. The base comes from the writer. So the story of how Critias got the information was certainly just a literary device used by Plato to put his point forward. Certainly to the Athenian statesman, that it would have been his audience. Certainly to put himself in a tale, to put himself, I guess, as the arbiter of knowledge in a tale about the dangers of hubris and pride would seem kind of counterproductive, as that would almost make him a boastful act to put himself as that character. So I am of the mind that that Plato obviously got the information firsthand from Egyptian priests, because as the story goes, when Socrates died, murdered or was put to death because he was making the youth rebel, I believe it was the story goes, or he was a rebellious character, and for whatever reason he was killed. Plato was his protege and immediately fled Greece and spent 13 years in Egypt studying under Egyptian priests, or at least that's what I believe is the tale. not sure if I have proof of that, but that's one story that I've heard. And it would make sense that that would be the case because the Cretaeus was actually written about 13 or 14 years after the death of Socrates. So the tales he got and the information he got about Egypt, or about Atlantis from Egypt would have made perfect sense in that context, as it's believed that Egyptians were actually visited, not say visited, but took in refugees from Atlantis post the cataclysm, and it makes perfect sense that they did, and that will become clearer later on. I mean, I can imagine that at this point, if you still believe that Atlantis is not real, that would seem pretty fantastical, mythical, just like me saying that Charbus is real, or the Cyclops of one eye is real, or there's a three-headed dog, or all this mythical stuff that really doesn't make any sense when you think about it in realistic terms. Nothing that I'm going to say is going to be outside of the realm of physics or reason, I guess. I mean, anything can be explained as a tall tale or an exaggeration or a mistaken word or a mistranslation here or there that just, over time ended up with a tall tale. But my take on it is that a tall tale is only as tall as the ground that it sits on. What do I mean by that? Is that, Paul Bunyan would only be 100 feet tall compared to the trees around him. It's always the setting. The setting is not what's exaggerated in tall tales. It's the events and characters inside those tales, and the setting serves as the anchor for that tale to make it more real to the individual, right? So these kind of tales always take place in settings that people can find relatable. You know what I mean? He could have put Atlantis on the moon, but he didn't, because that would have made it relatable to his Athenian statesman. So it's a relatable tale. So one thing you have to consider is that, again, he is getting the information that he tells us in the Cretaeus is not only about Atlantis. In fact, the first part of the Cretaeus is a detailed description of Greece at the time of its war, and it actually starts out with saying, but 9,000 years after the war between Athens and Greece and Athens and Atlantis is the events of this tale. And that's how it's described, as the war between Athens and Greece. Now, if Plato is getting the information about ancient Greece from Egypt and not from ancient Greece, it makes you wonder, right? How could he have gotten all these tales and woven them into that narrative? It's like there's a chapter also missing from ancient Greece, and it is described in the Cretaeus, and which is part of what's known as the Deucalion, which is a series of floods that happened over the thousands of years that had stripped away much of what was ancient Greece, and it's described in great detail about ancient Greece and its land. At the same time, it was at war with Atlantis, and it's not what is there now. Certainly, give me a second. I'll put up a map. I'm not even sure if anybody's actually listening to my talk tonight, but that is Greece as it sits now. Now, if you're familiar with my theory at all, the time frame that Atlantis existed in was 11,600 years ago at the end of the last ice age. Well, as it was coming out of the last ice age, I guess there's a little bit of ambiguity exactly when that was, but between 11,600 to 11,900 years ago, approximately. So, if you were to take that timeline as being gospel, I'm assuming you're walking into this knowing a little bit about my previous videos about Telepylos. And essentially what that theory posits is that, I should really get into that first before I talk about ancient Greece. So I'm sorry if I'm jumping around here, because I just want to make sure everybody is kind of on the same page. So what's important to know is that I have a theory that at the end of during the last glacial maximum, when sea levels had dropped globally by about 135 meters, in around the region of the Strait of Gibraltar, where currently the most shallowest elevation that exists there now is about minus 275 meters. I believe that, and it's part of a paper that I had put on academia.edu, is that between Bologna and Tangiers, there once existed a land bridge here. Now, what we see here now is just it's a more detailed map than what you can find on Google Earth. It's based on a little bit more higher resolution bathymetry, but I'm just putting it on Google Earth here in a relief map to give you an idea of what the actual bathymetry is, as opposed to switching over to the other engine, which is not as user friendly. So, what are we looking at here? Okay, what we're looking at is what the current state of the Strait of Gibraltar is. So, if we think back to the time that this was eroding, I'm sorry, I don't have a spiel plan on how to explain this. Might have to edit. I can't edit. This is a live stream, so bear with me here. I gather my thoughts. So, the Mediterranean Ocean is essentially a basin, the Mediterranean basin, in which the water can get up to a certain height. I mean, it'll overflow above a certain level into Africa and and lots of other areas. But as it sits at this current elevation, it's a basin. And as it's a basin, there is a net flow of water into the Mediterranean through all its tributaries, to the Black Sea, through the Nile, through many different areas, contribute to the water in the Mediterranean. And also, obviously, the Strait of Gibraltar, which has an influx of water. Now, what happens is if it gets cut off from the Mediterranean Atlantic get cut off, that net flow changes. And in current conditions where the Mediterranean is fairly hot, the Mediterranean could actually almost completely evaporate because of that differential between the flows going into it. So around 5 million years ago, what there was what was called the Messinian salinity crisis, in which case the Mediterranean did actually dry up, and there were massive salt deposits that were laid down in layers of sediment about 5 million years ago, but big layers of salt that or marine evaporates, and this is well known, and it happened. And there's a theory about the Zanclean mega flood and how that the end of that event, the Atlantic flooded in at this point and eroded the channel to this current state. Now, I've actually spoken with a number of people, including Aaron Mikolev, who was the author of the Zanclean mega flood theory, and the consensus I got from him and a number of others is that the sediment analysis that was done in those studies is inconclusive when it comes to the sedimentation deposition dates, because really there is no way to differentiate the because there is no stratification in the sediments in the subsurface sonar topography, if I'm saying that correctly. The sonar lines show stratification in different materials, but you would not see any differentiation between something that was laid down 10,000 years ago and almost 5 million years ago. You would think that there would be, but it's really watery, silty deposits that never get compacted. So they just remain as they are. They don't get compacted over time. So there's really no differentiation. So my theory does not actually contradict anybody. In fact, it's just an addendum to what the Zanclean mega flood theory is. My theory is that instead of it eroding to this current state 5 million years ago, when that Messinian salinity crisis ended, it actually eroded to a point where it's actually above this current location to an elevation of about minus 60 meters. And this is where the land bridge would have originally breached. And when it breached, when it finally eroded to the current position, all that silt has gone downstream into the Mediterranean on that side. I'm sorry if that's not a very good explanation, but simply put, I guess it's the elevation that this shoreline, the actual unbroken shoreline that we see here, that's about minus 275, which was the original shoreline I was looking at, between that and minus 250. So there's like a range that I was looking between minus 275 and 250. That was my original area that I believe was the ancient shoreline, because whereas the Zanclean mega flood theory they posited that it was a big massive flood that rapidly flooded the Mediterranean, which may have well happened for that phase. I believe the deeper area that remained at the minus 60 elevation was probably at the time more firmer bedrock, probably less prone to erosion than the top layers, and was the remainder after the Zanclean megaflood. So as a result, that when sea levels dropped during the last ice age, when sea levels dropped beyond that point, there became that separation once again, right? And it was in that time when the Earth was probably in the first 10,000 years of the Wisconsinian interglacial, or the Ice Age, basically the long name for the Ice Age that included a longer period of about 80 to 90,000 years. if I'm correct. It was at that time when it dropped below that minus 60 mark that the Mediterranean became its own microclimate. Now you might at this point you may say to yourself, okay, well, if that's the case and it separated like it did during the Messinian salinity crisis, then why wouldn't the Mediterranean dry up completely again, like it did then? And why would they be any different? And that's the beauty of what I'm proposing, and it gives me chills to say it, because consider why the sea levels are dropping globally. The sea levels are dropping globally because we're in an ice age. And what happens during an ice age? It's a cooler temperature. And in the Mediterranean basin, where it's really hot now, it's very, very hot in the Mediterranean Sea during most of the year. But certainly during that glacial period, the temperature would have been far more temperate in that zone, resulting in a completely different ecosystem, which would have resulted in a balanced flow of water that would have stabilized at what I believe was minus 250 meters below sea level now. So, why is that so important? Why is it so important that the sea level was 250 meters below where it is now? Because, well, that is where Telepylos sits. And, well, I mean, to say it sits at minus 250 is kind of my own theory. Because when it comes down to it, the city itself sits primarily at minus 200 meters. That's because it's elevated out of the water, right? And that's why I believe it's minus 250, because most of the city sitting at 200 would have not been elevated above sea level, and it would have been not very defensive at all. Whereas the massive seawalls, where I propose now, at 50 meters would have been significant. And there are reasons why I picked 50 meters above sea level as well. And there still might be debate that could be had on that actual figure. And nothing that I say is set in stone. Certainly, I've put up my work to be scrutinized by scientists, but unfortunately, I'm just not a peer, so I haven't been actually challenged on any of my actual numbers. But certainly, I expect there to be some variability. But with that number in mind, with that assumption, and certainly nothing I say is set in stone, what happens is that it completely redraws the map of the Mediterranean during that period. And also, okay, first off, it also negates the possibility that Atlantis is outside of the Mediterranean. You get it? Because, okay, first off, the timeline. For this to happen, Telepylos to exist, and this whole theory to exist at all, this had to have happened at the same time, contemporary with Atlantis. It's completely within that same window of civilization. So Telepylos is with Atlantis in the Mediterranean. And I can say that unequivocally, because it would have been no way for a boat to travel across this land bridge, and certainly it would have been like quite a distance up, and it certainly wider than it is there now, because like I said, this is the eroded state of that land bridge. The land bridge itself is gone, and I certainly have no way of knowing exactly how big it was on this map. I can only make estimates, and certainly it would only be a guesstimate. But certainly the minus 60 elevation is based more on the timing of the reflooding event of the Mediterranean, not necessarily anything else that you would see on the map here. I don't know if you get what I mean when I say that. Sorry if I don't explain everything completely. Do my best. So let's just switch to another map that I had created. Overlays. Let's see right here. Okay, new overlays. Boom. It'll take a second to load in. And this is another map that I had created using a different database. It's basically based on Google Earth Maps and their data set, which is basically the Jetco data set, which is lower resolution than what I generally use for Telepylos and a few of the other surveys. But it's good enough for mapping purposes. And good enough to illustrate what the Mediterranean would have looked like at that 250 meter elevation. And as you notice, there are vast differences in certain areas of this map that compared to what's there now. Certainly the area around Telepylos, if you're familiar with this map and where it is on the map, though it's not highlighted here and there now. Right about there. There. Anyway, where am I going with this? Okay, so Telepylos, if it's validated, I mean, and it's true, is Lake Atlantis would never have existed in a vacuum. And certainly Greece at the time of Atlantis was warring with it, would have, since it was a comparable force. If you read the Cretaeus, it actually describes again how bountiful and how plentiful the land was in around Greece around the time of the war with Atlantis. And it was far more lush than it is now. In fact, it's described as being just the remnant of what was there before. And if you look at this map, there are several things that if you actually read the Cretaeus, this would strike as being sound. Certainly, it's described as one of the things that Plato describes in detail of Greece at the time is the boundaries of Greece. Now, do I have those bookmarks up? I probably don't, just because I got so many bookmarks up on this thing, and I really didn't prepare for this. I kind of did it, like I said, off the cuff to kind of get over my own fears. Okay, hella stuff. Okay, so these are bookmarks. Inside of the Cretaeus, he talks about certain rivers like the Cetharion, the Pytheria, and the Oropus. Again, I'm not going into the details about those boundaries, but certainly that is the northern boundaries he's discussed, and I believe he says it's between Oropus and the continent, which he refers to as anything being north. But the important thing is not those boundaries, because that's not. They're all inland boundaries. The most important one he discusses, in my opinion, was the southern boundary, right? And in the Cretaeus, he describes the southern boundary as being an isthmus, right? Now, an isthmus is a narrow stretch of land that connects between two larger pieces of land. Certainly in Greece now, if you were to take off this map, if you look up isthmus is in Greece. There is only actually one, and that is the Isthmus of Corinth, which, again, is a small isthmus up here somewhere. I'm not really sure where it is, but it's inconsequential because it's the only isthmus that's described in Greece. So the fact that Plato describes the southern boundary as being an isthmus, and certainly nobody does now, is kind of a red flag. Certainly this map as it is now is an isthmus. This is the very definition of what an isthmus is. I mean, certainly if the mapping here is correct, there's the variability in my ocean level mapping around this area could actually almost completely connect these points here as well. There might be actually some tiny mistakes that I haven't corrected, but certainly this is what you would consider the Kytherian isthmus, I guess, or Kytherian peninsula. I think when you get down to it, this whole area then would the southern boundary of Crete and all connected would very well qualify as an isthmus, but without it, without these, without that land there, it's certainly not an isthmus, and nobody would claim that is an isthmus at all, because you can't even see between these islands in reality. Whereas if they were all shown, this is basically the gateway into ancient Greece. And it's also corroborated by their description of what happens past the isthmus, because he says past the isthmus it goes into a deep basin, beyond that into the deeper sea, where it's described as a shallow sea until it crosses the isthmus towards Egypt, and that's where it is. But again, this was described as an isthmus in those terms of the Deucalion prior to the Fleming. So there's also a few other things that are described. He describes that what was once there. Once was a lush land, and all of the flesh has been stripped away, like flesh, like meat off of a skeleton, and all that remains is but the bones of what once was. And again, when you take away all these possible lands that could have existed, and consider that all was all eroded away and flooded. All the tops of these mountains were probably very lush at one point, but according to the Deucalion, so many flooding events had happened over the 9,000 years that much of what was lost, much of what was there was stripped away. In fact, he goes into much detail. In fact, you know what? This is probably not the best map to show here for ancient Greece. I have another one that I created. I'm going to turn this off completely. And I'm going to put on Hella Prime map. Yeah, that's a better one. Did I turn that off already? Okay, and I am going to quickly turn the opacity down so you can kind of see that. So this is what I believe to be a better representation of the Greek map here. Now, it's important to note, I guess, that, certainly that cities like Athens are much further away from the coast than they would have been. So, in my opinion, the Athens that exists right now no, that's not true. The Athens has always existed where it is, and I shouldn't say that. because what I mean to say is that, okay, back it up. The story of Athens itself is actually pretty interesting when it comes to the Deucalion, in that it's described as once having, actually, I'm all over the place. Bear with me here, because now I'm kind of remembering something that probably should have included earlier, because was it? Yeah, it was this. I'm sorry. I'm thinking. As this is all Greek to me. Okay. In the Cretaeus, it's described as having existed, not as it is now, but is much of like Greece, the citadel or the hill that the Parthenon sat on was much more, I guess, soil. It was a bigger hill. Is what I'm trying to say. Right now it's just a rocky outcropping that has the Parthenon on it, but in the days that it was actually in use prior to the Deucalion, it was the soil extended for like kilometers. It was a very massive hill that had a lot of loose soil on it, but through flooding events, all of that soil got stripped away and put downstream. Is what I'm trying to say, and that is in the Cretaeus as well, which is fascinating. I hardly ever hear that mentioned. Greek has undergone a massive transformation, and it's written in the same pages in the dialogues in the passages prior to the description of Atlantis. Maybe some of it gets conflated with it, but it's described in there in great detail, and it's fascinating because much of what ancient Greece used to be probably didn't exist around Athens. I mean, you consider that most of these maritime nations would have had cities that are very, very much coastal. And if this map is indeed true, which I have no reason for not to believe it isn't, Athens would have been quite a far distance from the coast, which would have meant that there's probably a buried city somewhere in one of these, I believe, coves inside of Greece right now, but buried under very, very, very deep sediment. Very deep sediment. In fact, I don't have it highlighted here, but I'm of the mind that this spot, particular right here on the tip of this peninsula, is the most likely spot for an ancient Greek city, one that would have been at war with Atlantis at the time. Again, I speak of Atlantis as being real, and I hope that at one point we get to you believing that as well. There's a lot to explain as opposed to just saying, Atlantis was a big circle, because Plato had described Atlantis in great detail, but people get hung up on the number one statement that everybody always gets hung up on, and that is that Atlantis exists beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And I'm here to say that because all my theories, I'm putting this the wrong way. I sound like an idiot. I'm sorry if I don't come across as eloquent right now. I just not used to public speaking. But all my research, I should say, points to the fact that the Mediterranean was closed off during the height of this civilization, and if this was closed off during that point, certainly Atlantis is not outside of the Strait of Gibraltar. Obviously, the Strait of Gibraltar is not the Pillars of Hercules. Now, I am not the first person to make that statement. I am not even the most modern scholar I'd say modern scholar, the modern person, I don't call myself a scholar. I am not the most recent person to say this, and it has been actually something that has been debated for as long as people have traveled the seas. Now, I can go in great detail about the story involving the discovery of the Strait of Gibraltar, and it makes you wonder because, see, there's so much history to know as well, and even ancient scholars didn't know everything. They were looking for answers as well, and certainly Strabo of Amasia was probably the most well-known among those ancient Greek geographers and scholars. And when he wrote his book called the Geographica, he went on a journey in the Mediterranean trying to validate some of these ancient tales and actually put locations, nail down locations, and delve into the mystery itself. Which was fascinating. So certainly when he actually arrived at Cadiz, which was just outside of the Strait of Gibraltar, he actually talked to the founders of the city. Now, the city Cadiz, Spain, got its name from Gades, which was the name that was associated with being beyond the Pillars of Hercules at the time. Gades, or Gadiria, as it's stated in actually the Cretaeus as well, when he's talked about the kings of Atlantis. The sons of Atlantis were given each an area to rule over, and his eldest son was given the area that was opposite of Atlantis, across the Sea of Atlas and towards the Pillars, the area that was known as Gadiria in the Hellenic tongue, as far as I remember exactly how that goes. So, the founding of the city of Cadiz, which phonetically sounds like Gadiz, Gades, Gades, or Cadiz. You wouldn't think they are actually the same name, but they actually are the same name. Was founded. It was founded because the people. Okay, as the story goes, there was an oracle. I believe it was an Etruscan oracle, if I'm not mistaken, or a Tyrrhenian oracle, that was sent out around, I believe it was 1200 BC. They were sent out to search out the Pillars of Hercules, which itself is kind of makes you wonder, because why would you be searching for something that you already knew about it? So the Pillars of Hercules were in legend at that point, but they weren't never discovered. They were actually discovered by the people that were in search of the legendary location of the Pillars of Hercules. But unfortunately, what they found was not the actual Pillars of Hercules, because for other reasons they started in the wrong location. So when they headed west from which would have been Etruria, which is western Italy, they would never have come across the pillars from that location. If they would have started from Greece, they might have had better luck, but they certainly didn't. So, I mean, it's actually a very funny story. They actually traveled 3 times. The Etruscans were notoriously superstitious people. They would go on shore and they would kill a goat, sacrifice a goat, and throw its entrails on the ground, and they would interpret how the entrails fell, or if the entrails were, I don't know, looked weird. I don't know. They had their own ways of interpreting that, and whether it was a good omen or a bad omen, they determined whether or not they would go further in their in their voyage. So they were very superstitious. So it took actually 3 times for them to go from Etruria to the Strait, before they actually made it to the Strait of Gibraltar and through the Strait of Gibraltar, where they founded just beyond it the city of Cadiz. And there's a city up here. And this is where the city of Cadiz is, right here. I don't know why I don't move in and give you a little bit more details, be a little bit more mobile. I don't know if anybody's watching me right now. If you are, thank you for watching. This is just me ranting and ranting and ranting. Well, not ranting, just talking about my theories. Okay, so this is the island of Erythea, the legendary island of Erythea, where the Hesperides were, and this is where the island of the golden apples and the golden ox were apparently raised in the city. But that is not true. They believe that. We can get into a whole discussion on Melcat and the other variants of Hercules and the legends that are involved. Certainly there's a few points here. I found an old map, I don't have it up right now, but that described this as actually being the Pillars of Hercules. It's not. It was misattributed because it was the only thing that they could actually find that even came close to the description of the legend. And when they arrived here, they gave it that name. In fact, it was stated in the Geographica, if I'm not mistaken, that the founders don't believe, like I said, the founders don't believe that the Pillars of Hercules are the Strait of Gibraltar. They actually believed at some point that the pillars were actually right here. And again, that was one argument. There was also another argument against Melcat, which is the Moroccan equivalent, I believe, of Hercules. But again, that kind of all conflates. It's all people trying to add attribution after the fact, far after the fact. And I hate to say to the people of Spain, but any kind of connection to the Herculean legend is just unfounded in this area. It was misattributed right from the very beginning. We're talking about 1600 BC when this was originally founded. Okay, so again, they had to find it, which means that there was nobody there before. And if you just look at the Herculean legend, there was people there. Certainly, there would have been reason to believe that there were people there, because that would have been the path that Hercules would have taken with the golden cattle through there, like thousands of years prior. So it makes you wonder why they were looking for something. Had it been such a prominent landmark, or existed at all, then did the legend predate the structure, or was the structure based on the legend? Now, as the legend goes, they were looking for it and they found this. It wasn't like they found this and said, hey, let's make a... There was a legend that we can describe why this is what it is. And certainly most of the legends actually about Hercules don't actually describe him tearing the land asunder or doing some kind of magical feat where he actually breaks the continent apart, which happens to be a misconception in a lot of modern retellings, right? As far as the actual tale goes, I'm trying to remember who the actual quote came from, but the most reasonable explanation when he crossed through the pillars, it wasn't that the pillars are the land themselves. It was described as him laying basically cairns of stone, like just he made modest stone structures to denote his crossing point, because he See, the thing is, the stone markers were put there not for any other reason but for him to actually mark the best place across. That's what the markers were for. And I will. That's something that's further down in my theory when I actually describe where the actual pillars are located. But it's. What am I trying to get at? I'm kind of getting off the point here, because a lot of these stories, again, I'm trying to explain it in that Atlantis is not outside the Pillars of Hercules, because these aren't the Pillars of Hercules. These are basically the limits of the world at the time, and during the whole period of the Mediterranean being at the lower elevation. I should have a better way of saying that. During that whole glacial period, when the sea levels were lower, and again I had to put this map up. Takes a second to load in. So, I'm sorry, I'm kind of at a standstill here because I don't want to lay, I guess, all my cards out on the table, because certainly that is not the only map that I created in that manner. My next map involves this area, which I call the region of Gades, which has Telepylos sitting right here. I'm sorry, I'm not the best at making these videos. I really should have created an edited video, but this is kind of like, again, just me getting used to talking to the camera. So I apologize for the lulls in the production quality. I am going to quickly check over here and see if there's anything going on. If anybody's watching or any questions, no, I'm just going to get a retweet from Occam's Razor. Thank you, Occam. Okay. Let me gather my thoughts. Okay, so what's important, I guess, is that again, any theory that puts Atlantis outside of the Strait of Gibraltar and not the Pillars of Hercules is incorrect. And I'll say that unequivocally because it's within the Mediterranean right now. And in fact, I mean, so I'm surprised I haven't given it away already just by looking at this map, because if I'm telling you that it's in the Mediterranean and where it is, the astute among you might actually already know, should already know. I would think that it would be pretty obvious. I'm just not going to say it right now. Because I'm afraid. I don't want to get into that can of worms, because when it comes down to it, Telepylos deserves its day in the sun. It's just as big as Atlantis is, and it's there. It's there. Let's bring it up in case you need a reminding of what it is. I don't have it right now. Okay. So this is Telepylos sitting on the edge of the Maltese Escarpment. Now, you tell me that doesn't look like a city, right? Now, I was accused of pareidolia by a few scientists who immediately said, well, you just think that looks like a city. because it's like a square or something, I guess. I think even Carl Fegans had the nerve to tell me that this was repeating data. He was like saying that this is just repeating copied data. Like he actually knows what the bathymetry actually is. What a friggin' joke. Really, what a joke. Now, I don't have it overlaid, but the crux of the theory is that from here to here, the actual length and the height of the city is 100 stadia long. It's 100 stadia. Now you might say, okay, well, the stadia had a whole bunch of different values, right? Had a whole bunch of different values. What it came down to, though, is that a stadia was 600 of a foot, of a Greek foot, or whatever foot they had at the time. 600. So 600 times 100. So you're talking 60,000 units, right? Basically, is what the Telepylos is from north to south. 60,000 units. I'm telling you that it's 17.64 kilometers, right? Now, if I'm off by 200 meters, what will that mean to the actual unit of a foot? Nothing. We're talking about sub-unit, sub-millimeter mistakes. You know what I mean? It would be like saying that it's 29.6 as opposed to 29.55. I mean, you're talking about a half of a millimeter difference, and you know it'll add up on when you get to that scale. But even if I'm off in my number, even if the actual base unit is off, we're still talking about 60,000 units that are comparable to that base foot unit. I don't know how to put it anyway other than that. I mean, even if it's its own unit, if you divide 17.64, you divide 17.65 divided by 60,000 units, and you'll get a unit that's approximate to a foot or anywhere in the range of any of the other stadia units, is what I'm getting at. But more important than that is that it's divided. And it's not only that it's divided symmetrically, right? Now, it's 100 units, north to south, right? That's divided into 5 sections. Now, if you divided it evenly into 5 sections, you would get 520s, right? But that is not the case here, right? We got from north to south going 14, 24, 24, 24, and 14, right? What's beauty to that is that the width is also 25, right? So you think, okay, 24, 25, that's not really the same, right? But here's the deal, right? I mean, those two 14s are on the ends. They're kind of like buffer zones, right? But the beauty is that where it's 25 wide, the central zones are 25 by 24, right? Ultimately, they're 25 by 24. But what you're not considering is then all these regions are broken up into subregions, right? And you're going to have a boulevard, you're going to have major thoroughfares around the city. You're probably going to have a perimeter road. You're probably going to have a central boulevard. And those allocations are probably taken up in that extra stadia. And that's exactly what if I was an urban planner laying out Telepylos, that's what I would do. I would have it so that you'd have those right-of-ways, those road allocations, not part of your actual city grid. And that will leave you with even grids, even regions, and even roads around the whole city. And when you look at it, it's beautifully. It would have to be beautifully laid out. Why would you build a city to this size and not and put cow paths through there? You wouldn't have squiggly roads going through all the city. You're going to have a organized, regionalized, sectioned city, much like any Roman Empire city would have. And this is far, far earlier in our history than the Romans. Far earlier. So, there's much to discuss about the layout of the city itself, and I got a simulation where I have this is built in Unreal as well. I don't have that turned on right now, and I'm not planning on bringing that simulation. I'll probably do it in another video. But what's important of all this is that, okay, Telepylos is there, right? This isn't hypothetical. Telepylos is sitting on that shoreline, right? Now, the shoreline that I had drawn originally here is actually fairly close to what the more detailed shoreline is. Certainly, what I have here is actually following along that actual erosion channel that comes straight out of the main gate, the main entrance to Telepylos. And that's the reason why, again, it's just kind of like a smoking gun. You see, this channel here is what's called, well, it was created by created through channelized erosion, which means that there was a constant flow of water through this area during its formation while it was being buried, and up until the time it was being buried. So right up until that time, there was water flowing through here. And what you got to consider is that Telepylos itself is almost like the foundation of a weeping tile of the building. You know, it was the low point. It was a canal that surrounded the city like a moat. So as it was flooding in with silt, it was still collecting all the water from the surrounding terrain and filtering it through this canal and focusing it through this outflow, which is why this channel is so prominent and still exists. It was laid down in the very last days of Telepylos' demise. So, and why it's so important is that it's real. I mean, it's like standing next to the pyramids and saying that the pyramids aren't there. If you look at this and you say that it's a data anomaly, you are sadly mistaken. Sadly mistaken, because I've had experts look at it, people who actually do this for a living, who make bathymetry equipment, will look at this and say that is not an anomaly. Anomalies don't look quite like that. Now, if you look at, certainly there are a number of other areas in the Mediterranean, certainly along anywhere you'd find subsea cabling, where they had surveys of long subsea internet cabling systems put in. They created what looks like roads along the bottom of the Mediterranean, and much of what you see through the bathymetry is actually data anomalies, but this is not a data anomaly. Certainly one of the most, even if you can look past the fact that the city is 100 stadia by 25 stadia by itself, what's amazing is that the actual line going north to south on the inside wall here is a perfectly aligned north-south line. Now, I can't show it in Google Earth that is the case, but I brought this information into other software, and it's pixel perfect. I mean, I could not find a arcsecond of deviation from the north to south wall on this information. And if you understand how bathymetry is actually data imported and laid down, you would know that that would be a practical impossibility to lay out an anomaly like that. The anomaly might show up, but the data itself is sound and always georeferenced. So even there's no way that, let's say, a path of a ship and its survey patterns could could misalign the data that's below the sea level. It's all georeferenced and brought in and transformed within their software before it's stitched in. So that's 2 points that make Telepylos undeniably man-made, in my opinion. And the fact that the canal had to be artificial, had to be deep, had to be significant, had to be man-made because of its dimensions, and the fact that it remained a channel and even up to the point where it demised, again, speaks to it being an excavated structure. So that's certainly one point. The north to south and the actual layout of the city itself can only have been done by human hands. It'd be astronomically improbable for this not to be a city. Astronomical. So, with that in mind, let's say Telepylos would have been a major city, and its walls would have been formidable. You were talking 50 meters around most of the city, certainly the city proper, and that speaks of a city that was prepared and built for strong defense, strong maritime defense. Not something you build against just Roman pirates, but something that you'd build against an army. Something that you consider a formidable defensive stronghold. And that's what we're looking at here. And when you have such a city, and the necessity to build such a city, it wouldn't exist in a vacuum. Which is why it's not outside the realm of possibility to consider cities like Atlantis that coexisted with this city. While it's not mentioned in Plato's works at all, it is mentioned in Homer's Odyssey in Book 10. And described very well. It's not described very well. It's only described because, in terms of Odysseus's voyage there and his encounter with it, which was very limited. I'm not really prepared to talk about that. I would better have my my Unreal simulation up here. I'll probably draw it in, I suppose. Will you bear with me for 1 second? Or I'll dock in a draw window where I can draw on the surface here a little bit. So, as we can see here, this is this is the line. Okay, I'll just draw freehand. Sorry, I'm thinking out loud. So this is the cliff that he described as being along the north wall where he anchored his ship. Right? And this is the gate where his men would have gone in. The ships would have went forward into the gate to a sheltered harbor. Now, he was following behind further back here at first in this area. And when he was worried about what was going on inside the harbor here, he decided to go to a rocky outcropping along this area, which I believe was actually right here. That is approximately where he would have moored his ship, because it would have gave him a good view of the area. There is a higher area of elevation just on the north side of the coast here, which would have gave him a perfect view. Now he described his men as going across and landing on a beach, which, if you look here again, this area right here is very silty area, which would have been a beach. And my approximation, that easily could have been a beachhead where they would have gotten ashore and went to meet the Telepylos, the Lastrygonians, and had their adventures or their misadventures. The problem is that we don't really know much of the story, unfortunately, because he had moored his ship, like I said, over here, across the harbor, and he only viewed his men going across. And it's a bit sketchy of a tale because he doesn't really describe how he got the information back. He only describes what happened next. After his men disappeared, he describes the whole story of how he met his men had met the what's his name, Antiphates, or actually the wife of Antiphates. First he met the daughter of Antiphates, who was fetching water, and then she brought the men to meet her mother, which was the wife of Antiphates, and they described her as being as big as a mountain. So, when they described her as being as big as a mountain, apparently she took offense with this and called for her husband to come, in which he got really angry that they called his wife as big as a mountain, and he proceeded to imprison them, or, well, as the story goes, he cannibalized them, and the rest of his men who were sheltered in the harbor, they threw rocks and speared the men that were in the ship, and they destroyed the ship to splinters. And as the story goes, Odysseus was around here somewhere with his ship, and he saw this happening as the men were trying to flee through the entrance back, that they were being destroyed. And when he saw this, he cut his line and he got the hell out of there. He left, and he mourned his men, and he left and never looked back. So that's the story of his limited exposure to Telepylos and Homer's description of Telepylos. That's how, as far as it goes. Well, he also mentions the headland to the south as well, which is kind of important. It doesn't mention a lighthouse, but he does mention a headland to the south on the other side as it leads into the harbor. So, the Homeric description only matches, I guess, in a very loose way. I can see how the setting would work, and how I built the model out makes perfect sense from the vantage points that are given, that he could have moored his ship there, and he could have looked across and saw his men go into the woods and escape into the city. But we don't know very much about that. We only make assumptions based on the story that's told. And from Odysseus's point of view, his men were indeed killed, and his ships were splintered, and certainly his men were speared as they were fish. But the attributions that they were cannibals or giants are completely unfounded, I guess. There is no real description if you read through the actual Odyssey of them being giants. The descriptions were actually kind of weirdly described, because it's described that Antiphates' wife was as big as a mountain. Certainly that could just refer to her obesity. She could have been a very plump woman, very something that would have not been commonplace among the ancient Greeks, or certainly among the ancient peoples. So they could have remarked at her girth and insulted the lady, which would explain why she was so insulted, why she sent for her husband, and why she wanted him killed. certainly I can imagine a wisecracking joke that could have been said by Odysseus's men to the fact that he could have said, "Well, what's he going to do? Eat us?" You know, which again could have been the reason why they were called cannibals. But it's really hard to know the details or whether or not where you actually draw the line on the myth of the story and the actual what could be the real interaction of somebody at the city. And I think there is always a line, but in this case, the myth that exists is that they're cannibals and that they were giants. And there's another phrase that is said in the Odyssey. It's weird because they don't say that they were giants. They say more like they were giants, and like they said, they hurled boulders like they were giants because the boulders that were thrown. Actually, they describe the boulders as being normal sized boulders that a man can carry, but as if they were thrown by giants. And that is to say that the men threw rocks the size that they could carry from the high cliffs, but when they finally hit the rocks, hit the ships, they were as if giants had thrown them. And it's also what they talk about the spear. They say the men were speared as if they were fish to be devoured for a meal. They say the men were speared as if they were fish for a meal. They didn't say the men were speared and then were taken away to be devoured as a meal. They said that they were speared as if they were fish. So basically, they were on top of the cliff throwing spears. They speared them, probably speared right through them, and they're like, "Oh man, it's speared like a fish." So in Odysseus' haste to leave Telepylos, that's the story that remained. That's the story that he took away from his encounter with Telepylos. Doesn't mention anything about the grandeur of the city, how big it was. And certainly in the tale that's described that happens within the city, there's no way Odysseus, had he actually experienced this, would have even known by the tale itself, because it's described as like he stayed ashore and he only saw his ships being splintered, so he would have had nobody to recount the tale of what had happened on shore, because he had stated right there in the Odyssey that every man dies. He doesn't mention anything about the herald coming back, which the herald could have came back and relayed that information, but it's not stated in the Odyssey that he did. So one can only assume that it's either he came back, they did mention that he came back and they relayed that extra bit of information, or that he just made up the details to explain the events that transpired from a distance. Either way, the perspective that we see from the Homeric tale is not a true representation of Telepylos, but just a glimpse of what was there, unfortunately. Unlike Atlantis, which goes into far more detail about the city, which is almost unbelievable when you think about it, because like I said, we can look at aerial views of the city and see how big it is and how grand it is. But when you're on the ocean level, you do not have any clue what you're seeing. Certainly, the city itself was all sheltered by these I guess what you call them, this is basically an island that was obscuring the city itself. I mean, even if there were lights coming from the city, they had fires. This would have been a forested island, almost uninhabited island that would have blocked much of the view, as Odysseus even describes it. He describes it as being a forest and mountains, but only wisps of smoke that appeared above the trees beyond. He can only see, and that was even after he climbed to the top of a rocky outcropping. So they were hiding themselves pretty good, but again, they never had a bird's eye view, which makes you think. I mean, Atlantis was described in vast detail, and in order to know that the city was circular, certainly as an individual without a plane, you would have to have first-hand knowledge of the city, or, I mean, someone had to show you a map. You might have gathered that the city is round firsthand by living in the city for a number of years and traveling around and noticing, landmarks and say, oh, it's around from here to here. You probably could have surveyed the city yourself to ultimately, in your own brain, realize what the dimensions of Atlantis was. But certainly the Platonic description of Atlantis is so detailed that it would have had to have been first-hand information from a builder or someone who had seen a map of the city proper that was made by someone who had built the city. So we're at a bit of a disadvantage in that respect. Is that this doesn't exactly match. It doesn't exactly match the description that Homer gave, because Homer really didn't give much of a description. He never had any more knowledge than what, again, Odysseus had experienced, or whoever that character was. But again, what he did see matches what's there perfectly, and certainly it's in the right region. It's where you would expect to find it. Certainly, scholars had mentioned it being south of Sicily prior to my discovery of it. They had mentioned it, I think, Thucydides, or I believe, or one of the other ancient Greek scholars had mentioned it being in this region, and it was surprising that nobody had mentioned it before. Well, okay. That's not true. I mean, somebody had actually discovered this location prior to me. I will admit that is Dr. Luigi Usai, who discovered it in 2021 prior to me. But I had never heard of his name. I hadn't heard of his research. I hadn't heard this announced to the world, to be honest with you. And after looking at his research, he failed to give it the proper attribution. He never realized it was Telepylos, and he never knew that it was how it could be where it was. He never even recognized that at the current sea level understanding of minus 135, that this entire city would have still been submerged during the last ice age. So it's only my theory that brings this into the realm of possibility. And it's bringing the sea level down to minus 250. That opens up an entire set of other possibilities for discovering other lost civilizations in the Mediterranean at the time. Because Atlantis, Telepylos, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, they all existed far earlier than we believe. In fact, to say that ancient Greece existed prior to ancient Greece is kind of a weird thing to say, because there was a Greece that existed before ancient Greece. There's what I call proto-Greece, or I call it Hellas. I mean, even though Greece calls itself Hellas anyway, that's the word for Greece in the Greek tongue, Hellas. I don't know if I'm saying that right. But to say that it's a primordial or proto version of those city-states that existed far, far before the days of Plato. And we're talking that's talking at least 4 civilizations. The proto-Egyptians who existed prior to the actual building of the Great Pyramid. They existed in that area. The Nile Delta was certainly bigger in those days than it was during even the heyday of most of the pharaohs. If you back that out and look at the at the Nile Delta, we have a possibility for quite a few discoveries that are in this area as well. But, I mean, that's kind of pointless. It's almost like digging up the entire Nile Delta. There's so much silt and sediment, so much area to cover, that unless you're specifically looking for something, you are not going to find it. You know what I mean? There's just, you have to have a reason to look. But certainly even below the current topography of ancient Egypt, there is so much silt and buildup over the millennia of flooding of the Nile Delta that it makes looking for anything along the coast here just almost impossible to do. But the point I was trying to make is that these civilizations, even the ones that we consider the ancient civilizations, had a precursor to each one of them that existed in their areas prior to their ancient compatriots. So saying the word ancient, it's almost like we need a word that describes pre-ancient, or again, to find that word, I'm kind of lost. I like to use the word primordial, but that seems to fit the most. Primordial Greece, or Proto-Greece, or Proto-Egypt, or Primordial Egypt actually applies quite a bit, actually, in because they use that term to describe the primordial mound and the time before creation. But again, even that primordial is almost like going back way too far. Sorry, I'm kind of a loss for the right word to describe it. But you're talking ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, Telepylos. You're talking a few other civilizations too. Atlantis. We're talking who else? The Hyperboreans are also a missing civilization. The Tartessians, not to be confused with the Tartarians. I guess the Tartessians would have been the kingdom that Hercules had encountered when he was looking to travel across the sea to the island of Hesperides. He needed a boat to travel, and they gave him what was called a golden chalice to cross the sea. But it was there in his travels in northern Africa that he came across the Tartessian civilization. They're rarely mentioned, but they are a lost civilization that, I mean, it certainly was described as from the Herculean tale as being a vast kingdom of riches, but rarely mentioned beyond that, as it was taken to be complete mythology, much like a lot of these things. And like the same with the Hyperboreans. The Hyperboreans were also another people that were described as being from the far north. There isn't much more to say about them right now. Again, to talk about the Hyperboreans would be playing my hand to Atlantis, and I'm trying to avoid it, going into great detail about that yet. Yeah. It's not like I'm trying to hide it from you, individual, whoever is watching this video. It's like this. Have you ever seen the movie The Usual Suspects? In The Usual Suspects, there's a lineup of people, and you're not told who the killer was or who the ringleader was until the very end, but you're giving lots of clues to who that guy is. But just like any story, you don't want to have the ending given away too soon. Otherwise, you could never know who Kaiser Soze was if you've seen that movie, for example, or you could never unsee the ending of a movie. You can never unknow that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's father. So I feel like it's a burden that I have to tell you Atlantis and where it is right now without giving you the context of the whole story is only doing you a disservice. It is. It's giving you the punchline to the joke before the joke. It's telling you the ending of the movie before you saw the movie at all. Even it's like giving away the movie in the credits. And it's the greatest story never told, honestly. And if I do it wrong, I'm wasting an opportunity. And it's my biggest struggling point is that you deserve better production value than what I am providing in these videos. So this is why I'm working on it. So if you're watching this still, kudos to you. You put up with me for a long period of time. This would work much better as an interview because then I'd have somebody constantly ask me questions to kind of push me along, to keep me going, because I can't see the gap in what you are not seeing from what I told you already so far. So that's where we're at. But certainly there are so many civilizations that could have existed in this in this dropped shoreline that it boggles the imagination. And to find one definite location of a major city, it should be enough to spark interest worldwide about the possibility of Atlantis. And I'm only withholding it for that. If I had a bigger platform, if for example Joe Rogan caught wind of this stupid little video I'm making here and asked me point blank, I would explain it to him in no uncertain terms where it is. Though again, I'd have to talk to him for hours describing much of what I've discussed so far in this video, which is laying the groundwork for Atlantis, because like I said, Atlantis lies on this shoreline. Whether or not you've been looking around behind my back while I've been doing this to try to find it, I mean, I don't blame you to pause it and look at this map and kind of think about things for a bit where Atlantis could be, because I'm not hiding it. I can't hide something that's there, plain as day. It's there. It's just not what you think it is. I don't want to spill it out, so maybe I'll do it in an upcoming video. If this video gets any views and gets any traction, or if my podcast with the Earth Ancients goes well, or if I can just get a little bit more traction, I am dying to tell this story. Or if I can make a video that is edited well enough, I could throw together. But there is even far more to it than I'm even alluding to so far, because it's complex. It's complex. It is. It's more complex than I'm even letting on to. There's much more to describe. And when the picture becomes more clear, it's going to open a renaissance in archaeology. Well, it should anyway, because I mean, there's so many things just waiting to be discovered under the sea that I mean, it would make Jules Verne, dream a thousand more dreams. It would make. It would inspire. It should inspire movies. It should inspire epic tales. It should inspire video games. It should inspire the entire world, because it's a missing chapter that defines our very beginnings. This is the cradle of civilization. You can say it's Mesopotamia, but it is right here. You're looking at the cradle that spawned the very first civilizations. Every mystery, every loose end that comes out of nowhere, every spontaneous generation of a culture, every weird name can be explained by this map. Simply, it can be. And I've spent a lot of time trying to re-educate myself on mythologies, certainly involving Hercules and Odysseus, for example, and try to pinpoint locations that are on their voyages that corroborate with this map. And I tell you, there are countless numbers of them. I've counted. I found the island of Circe. I found Aelia. I found certainly Atlantis. I found the Iridian Islands. I found the Blessed Isles. I found. I believe I found locations of places that blow your mind. Like I was talking about, the land of the Lotus Eaters is in there. We got the very gates of the underworld itself is possibly. I mean, that's the most far-fetched part of my theory. Actually, the gates of the underworld, but certainly there are countless stories that have resulted in certain places getting the names that they have, and there's countless other stories that just don't match the topography that we currently have, but match what this map provides. In upcoming videos, I will go into a little bit more detail about that mythology, about the other stops on Odysseus' voyage, how it ties into the Herculean legend. I mean, because Hercules and Odysseus were tied together through the events of the Trojan War. Well, kind of the Trojan War. I mean, Hercules was at Troy prior to the war, and Odysseus was there during the war, with Jason and the Argonauts. So that was there's a couple generations that separate Odysseus and Hercules. But here's the deal. Here's what changes everything. We believe Troy is where it is, but it's not where it is, because Troy, fortunately, sorry, that's the wrong window. Troy, as it's currently understood, is far inland, and it's way inland now. And certainly in the time that we're talking, and I'm proposing, it's much further away from the shore than it is now. And if you look at the descriptions of Troy in the Iliad, there are maps that are drawn out and distances that are estimated from the shoreline, and all of a sudden, if Odysseus was at Troy, Hercules was at Troy, and this map is the map of ancient Hellas, then certainly Troy is not Troy, because it doesn't match the Iliad's tale, which puts Troy in a completely different spot. Now, I have not located Troy yet. I have spent countless hours looking for what I believe Troy is, and it is still on my top of my search list. But suffice to say, Troy, Hercules, all the events of the Argonauts, all those events in those stories that are all tied together, did not take place in the Mycenaean era. It did not take place 1200 BC. It didn't take place anywhere close to that timeline. It took place, drumroll, 10,000 years ago, 11,000 years ago. I mean, around the time that Atlantis fell. Because the events of Atlantis falling happened after they went to war with Greece. And that's described as being 9,000 years before the time of Plato. 9,600 years before the time that Plato describes it in the Cretaceous. That was when Atlantis was at war with Greece, or the Greece of this time. Right. So, what does that all mean? That means that much of what they thought, what archaeologists believe is to be Troy, is probably just another city, probably a major city, which is not mentioned or misattributed, but it was certainly not Troy. And I can say that with pretty good certainty too, because again, look at all the shoreline differences. It would have meant that they would have marched significantly longer from the shoreline to reach what was thought to be Troy in Turkey. The exact location is not mentioned here. Okay, let me look up. Right, because they don't have Troy listed as being Troy. Just give me one quick second here. I was actually paying attention. Just can't remember. Bet that I have to look this up, but just I can never remember the spelling of Historic. Yeah, right. Let's just quickly put that in the map. I should have it there somewhere, but again, not prepared 100%. Probably have it as a bookmark, right? So there's where Troy is. I mean, okay. Let's just okay. Yeah, I'm not going to go into much detail about that, just because, first off, even if it was along the shoreline where it should have been, it doesn't match the descriptions. I would have argued that even if this map hadn't changed. I would have argued it, because it didn't actually match the map distance that is shown in it. It doesn't match the hills on the map. It doesn't match a whole bunch of descriptions that was laid out in the Iliad. But certainly pushing the shoreline in here further exacerbates that assumption. And anyway, that's my belief on that. Certainly, even if it was the same city, the events that happened, the events of the Trojan War, have, in order to coincide with Odysseus and Hercules, would have had to exist at the same time as Odysseus and Hercules. For Odysseus to exist at all, and his account of Telepylos to be valid at all, the last time that Telepylos was above sea level was over 8,600 BC. Or over 10,600 years ago, or 1,000 years after Atlantis. Now, that's purely an estimate on my part. That could be off by 100 years or more. I have no way of knowing exactly when that date was flooded, because it would have been a gradual flooding from the time that Atlantis fell to the time that Telepylos was uninhabitable. It's hard to determine, because they might have allowed the sea to rise 20 meters, 40 meters before they decide to abandon the city. They might have actually abandoned the city very contemporary with Atlantis. It's hard to say. They didn't experience the same cataclysmic flooding event that Atlantis did, because they existed in a different part of the ocean. That's a big hint. So they didn't experience the same cataclysm. they were fortunate that way. They had a slow flooding event, which is why which is why it is what it is. In fact, had Telepylos been more of a sudden flooding, actually it would probably be far more prominent, because this silt that filled up the canal that encircles the city would have been a singular event. And depending on the dynamics of that flow, it might have not actually flooded to the same level. But because it was slowly flooded over a long period of time, it filled up. And it kept filling up and draining out through that channel. And that's why the channel is deep here. Again, had it flooded quickly, the channel might have been deeper around the whole city, and this actually might not have actually flooded, be as deep a cut as is there now. So that's kind of what tells me that it was a slow flooding event and not a quick inundation of water that buried the Telepylos. That's my reasoning. But again, I'm not a geologist. I only understand a little, I guess, about flood dynamics and deposition rates and whatnot from what I've researched in my attempt to understand Telepylos. So where does that put us? I hope at this point, if you've listened to this as long as you have to get to here, you understand that this is a lot of information, and once it clicks, a paradigm should shift in your mind on how the Mediterranean was a completely different ecosystem. It was a different climate. It was stable for tens of thousands of years and supported ancient civilizations that were the proto-civilizations to what we have now. And I would imagine each one of them were comparable with the ancient Romans, the ancient Etruscans, or the ancient Greeks. They probably reached comparable levels of technology, and certainly any claims beyond our modern age would be ridiculous. I mean, certainly they never had engines and boats and that were faster than our modern things. They never had satellites. They never had planes. They never had vast technologies. But they probably had a vast knowledge of civil engineering, mechanical engineering, and principles, and certainly medicines, and enough to develop an advanced civilization. But the fantastical mythological versions that we see in popular media are just that. They're dreams, they're fantasies. They're meant to entertain the mind, and make you think that they could have been far more advanced than we are today. And who knows, they might have discovered some technologies that we haven't. But there's no way of knowing that at this point. Certainly, it's still fun to dream that there are there's aspects that could exist in the world. But I mean, I approach all my work here completely with science in mind. And if it can't be explained in the laws of physics, then it's tossed out. Really, it's not valid unless it can be replicated. But it's still good to dream. It's still fun to dream about what could be. Magic, I guess, the limits of what we know versus the limits of another person's technology. Right. So again, I appreciate your time and thank you for listening. This was an attempt for me to get out of my shell and to get used to talking about this publicly. I hope that If you have any questions, you're not afraid to ask me them in the comments. And please like, subscribe, share. If you can support my research, it would be much obliged. I have plans to actually explore this site with an ROV to actually validate its authenticity and to prove that it is actually a long lost city. I have a targeted plan in place, certain locations that just sound like a National Treasure movie, like Indiana Jones movie. Honestly, I can't describe it in any other terms. If I had only $100,000 right now, I'd have my own boat out there and I'd be diving the site myself. Unfortunately, I still got a family to feed here in my home, and I haven't found a benefactor to support my wild dreams and aspirations of actually diving the site myself and finding any sunken treasure or sunken statues and structures and whatnot. That's my biggest dream, is build to see the site firsthand. So again, thank you for listening. I will probably sign out now, and certainly, again, if you have any questions, please ask. It will guide any future videos and help me refine my story. Remind me what I can cut all the fat, and what I could add to make it more clear presentation. Certainly, I have other videos that I could share. But again, this was a kind of off-the-cuff presentation. I hope you enjoyed it.